Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Philosophical Liberal. This is the second part of what is becoming a mini series of our exploration of virtue, why virtue matters. So, if you haven't checked it out yet, you should definitely see the episode we did last time where we were connecting the importance of virtue with flourishing, with greatness, and now we really want to connect virtue with the first of our main core values with philosophical liberalism, which is freedom. And there is, I think, a lot to say about this that isn't said enough by those of us who advocate for a free society. So I'm really excited to get into this conversation with you today, Chris.
Yeah, likewise. Thanks, Joia. And I think it's good that we are pausing through its own dedicated discussion on the freedom value, uh, separate and distinct from the other two core values of flourishing and greatness, which we covered last session, because in many ways that really is the bridge to our whole political project here at 1776 Forward, which is about build, building a revolution for a freer society. And so I think the question that animates tonight's discussion, why does virtue matter for freedom, is a central one. And it will help, I think, explain for everybody why our statement takes so much time and effort and space to cover virtues. It's as far as I know from all of my studies on liberty ideas, it's unique in that respect. Many speakers and liberty leaders have spoken about the importance of virtue, but I don't think anyone's quite laid out a kind of a list of virtues as we did, or a kind of system. I didn't want to use that word. I know that can be loaded sometimes, even in describing our own work. But that actually went beyond just saying virtue as like a concept to actually give people more concrete details and kind of shape to what that means and looks like. So, when I started to think about even this question for today's discussion about why does virtue matter for freedom specifically, I kind of started, well, what what is the context we're talking about? And to me, it's a social context because, of course, if we all lived on a deserted island, then freedom doesn't really matter. Our actions don't really matter because they only impact upon us. But freedom certainly in the political context is all about what actions you're going to take vis-a-vis other people. And that is certainly that social context is certainly the one that we're most interested in through our project here at the Philosophical Liberals. So when we look in the social context, freedom is all about the actions that we can take in our life and how those actions impact on other people. So, freedom totally unbound. I mean, as the word itself implies, and as I think all of us or most human beings kind of instinctually understand it to mean, it's kind of like, free as a bird, right? Like you could just do and be anything. And, you know, for those of us who are liberty leaders and responsible people advocating for the benefits of liberty and freedom, I think that usually connotes positive things. But, as just a statement of fact, it's kind of morally agnostic, right? Doing and being anything free as a bird, can go in any direction. So I think with all of the many ways and the great power that comes with freedom, it can also be very destructive, right? And so we need a guide essentially to help us identify how to utilize that freedom and to direct it towards more productive ends. You might call this a morality, even. When we think about what purpose morality serves, we talked in one of our recent episodes about how morality is essentially values plus virtues. Um, and so here too, even when it comes to helping us figure out how to use our freedom to act in positive ways, you know, virtue is another way of doing that. I mean, virtue is literally the action half of the morality equation generally, and I think we can apply it to the question of how do we act in a free society more specifically and particularly. So that's one thing. And then I think virtues help us bound our freedom in ways that support human life, not just your own, but others, because they create the responsibility. So I like the phrase, comes from Spider-Man, for those of you who are comic fans, from Uncle Ben. Gave to Peter Parker that famous line right before he was murdered of with great power comes great responsibility. And that is always, I think, has been the slogan for Spider-Man and kind of the moral compass for his work. And I think it's a perfect phrase for this question of what do we do with our freedom? Because as we just said, it does give you great power to do anything, but it comes with a great responsibility. And responsibility even is a virtue. We're going to talk about that. It's in our list for those who have looked ahead, but it just, I think virtues are the responsibility portion of even that phrase. And then the only other point I would make is that beyond just limiting or kind of bounding our freedom, I want to emphasize the positive aspect of virtues in this context here, which is that they help us maximize the benefits of freedom, but because by being responsible, acting positively, taking good actions that further our life and others, we not only can expand our own freedom, but that of others. And frankly, you can't really have a free society or a free market without virtue either, because if people aren't honest, if they aren't operating rationally, if they aren't operating productively, then we very quickly fall back into the predator prey model versus what we advocate, which is the creator trader win-win model. So, and then, just one last point, I guess, here, I'm just looking at my notes even. Freedom, especially when we talk about a free society, is all about a self-governing society. Any type of democratic or elected or representative government, which all free societies have to one degree or another, they kind of operate under the self-governance principle, but that that structure or that kind of governing system kind of presupposes that the individuals themselves who are making those decisions about their representatives or their laws are self-governing for themselves, and virtue is the way that we do that as well. So for all of those reasons, that's kind of my breakdown or answer, multi-part answer to this question of why does virtue matter for freedom. So I'll stop there and turn it over to you.
Sure. Well, and I think it's important for people to realize clearly, if you've read our statement, you know that our vision of freedom is not at all synonymous with anarchy. It's not at all do whatever you want. So we're going to get, as you pointed out, very shortly into some of our more uh, the more of the details about our vision of what is fundamental to an actual free society. For example, the whole concept of rights. And I think we're going to have a really interesting question of do rights bind you or are they what enable your freedom? And there's going to be a whole fascinating conversation we're going to have here, I think, just on this term, because there is one way you could say that individual rights certainly do bind you. If everyone has a right to life, then that means that nobody has a right to murder. Just as a clear example right off the bat. So in a sense, it's a principle that binds you, but also empowers and is what enables your freedom. And I think this is important to realize as we're talking about why it is that virtues matter so much. And you had a phrase that I really liked that I'm going to try to paraphrase you, but you said something to the extent of just because you can do
Oh,
something
yeah.
doesn't mean that you should or that you ought to do something. And
Thank
so
you. Yes,
to
that
pick
that
up
was
on to
yes, that was the end of my point about being self-governing is that
yes.
phrase too. My second important phrase
So
here.
you say it because I don't want to just paraphrase what you
I
said. I
mean,
want
you
you.
pretty much said it, which
Oh,
is
okay.
just because you can do something doesn't mean you should. It's as simple as
Exactly.
that.
And I think this ties in with the point that you were making about why, well, first of all, a free market requires people to be virtuous because free markets entrepreneurship is all about creating value. And as we connected the last time, that if values are the what, the things that you are out to get, Virtue is the how. It is virtues are the actions that you're taking that are what is it that makes it possible to be creating value. So certainly just in a free market system, in an entrepreneurial system, that's required. But just in order to live a full life, it is what is required. And this, I think, it maybe goes back to our earlier conversation about tying virtue to flourishing. That with your most recent phrase here, just because you can do something, just because you have the freedom to do something, doesn't mean that that action is going to lead you toward flourishing. And so, virtue is what gives us the direction, the knowledge, the insight as to what it is we ought to be pursuing if what it is that we want to achieve actually is flourishing and maybe even ultimately greatness. And then I wanted to make this point that I think is very true and not made enough. Something that I think the founders understood, and that many of today's advocates of liberty don't either understand or emphasize enough. And I see it as this kind of duality that a free society requires a virtuous population. It requires, as you pointed out, people who are capable of being self-governing. And the flip side of that is that if you are a virtuous person, especially with the virtues that we've identified that are consonant with freedom, flourishing, and greatness, that when you have built these virtues into your character, that you will demand nothing less than freedom. Virtue is what makes it capable for you to reap the full benefits of freedom. And then once you are someone who is capable of doing that, you will not ever agree to live as a slave.
I love that. And I want to come back to that point and just drill into it a little more because I have a question that I think is very relevant and related to that. But touching on another point that you made that I just want to kind of pick up on is um, we this point about how virtues are not just about limitation, but about liberation, just to
Mhm.
keep with the L's here. And we're
And
gonna
with our
keep
theme
it.
of freedom,
Yeah, exactly. And we're gonna keep with the L's here because, if I had to rant, for example, among the various proponents of liberty in our modern culture, there's the Libertarian Party, for example. And not to pick on them, but we'll pick on them for tonight briefly. Because I think oftentimes they try to carry the mantle of like the staunchest or purest defenders of freedom in today's political culture. Um, but when you boiled it down to kind of and literally, kind of the root of libertarian philosophy from kind of their founders was the non-aggression principle that basically everything boils down to don't initiate force against anybody else. And first off, I mean, and so they pretty much reduce their entire political philosophy to that, and then it builds from that to all of their kind of implications about political economy and governing structure from that. That's how they justify and explain their freedom ethics. But if you just think about it, if it's all reduced to that one principle, one, it is a kind of negative. It's saying what not to do. And then two, and without kind of giving you um, the positive of what to do. And then my second point, what was my second point? Besides that, well, I just think that by not having that positive, it's part of why they aren't able to uh, inspire, I think, broad-based support and really make an impact in the political culture. I mean, they consistently, are kind of a gadfly in American politics, and no more, unfortunately. And as a liberty leader and activist myself, I want to see as many. We are Big Tent at 1776 Forward, so we want to see as many people rowing in the same direction as we are for a freer society. So I think we would benefit from a kind of stronger libertarian party, but I think, you have to, this is where you have to see what kind of drives and motivates a movement and its people. And this is perhaps why we've tried to focus more on virtues, because that fills in the positive side of what we should do, which I just always think human beings are more motivated by a positive than a negative. Not always,
Exactly.
not all people always in all circumstances, but the typical human more often than not, I think, needs a positive motivator more than a negative one.
And certainly in this context, when what we're talking about is how do you live your life? How do you conduct yourself? What is the aim that you're trying to create with a political movement that is grounded in a philosophy? And I think we should point out that you and I would absolutely agree with the NAP, as they call it, the non-aggression principle. We think it's true. It's just not the proper fundamental and or the endpoint in both senses. It's not what we're aiming toward, and it's therefore not what we want to build the structure of our movement on top of. We
Right.
want to start with that kernel of what is the good, what is the positive vision, what we should be aspiring toward. And virtue is, I think, a huge part of what gives us that vision. And and I think there is just something missing when you don't address this part. The thing that I think the founders did understand, that when you don't have people who are inspired to be creating value, to be building these values into their character, their lives, their communities, that you're not going to actually end up with a free society that is functioning. Right?
Yeah.
Like we're if all we do is tell people what not to do. There's almost sort of the joke, I guess, maybe perhaps sometimes about libertarianism, that you could be a perfect libertarian and just be someone that like sits on your couch and smokes weed and watches Netflix and is totally obese and like
Yeah.
you know lives off your parents and or somebody else and is doing nothing to actually build anything positive for yourself or for others. And it's just not an inspiring vision of how a person actually lives a life that is meaningful, that achieves deep happiness, that flourishes in our language.
Agreed. And I would say two other points that now I remember what my other second point was, but I guess now my third point was, you know, the other limiting factor of the nap, and this, I think it even illustrates why being based on a negative is always kind of inherently limiting, is it's completely out of context, right? So if you just hold that one principle kind of always in all circumstances, then I mean, part of one of my big beefs with libertarianism is that it essentially has a foreign policy of pacifism, because the NAP principle essentially tells them, well, don't ever lift a finger of aggression. Now, I'm oversimplifying a little bit. Not
Mm.
every libertarian believes that in that way, but most of them, that's how they apply it. But I think, a proper, and we will talk about this certainly in Article 3 about proper governing structure, just in the way that, unlike probably the anarcho-libertarian segment within libertarianism that sees, the total end state ideal of being anarchy, just as we don't argue for that and reject that, and instead argue for the necessity of a proper government, so too I would argue that in that structure and with a proper set of values, there will be times when uh, preemptive force may be warranted and justified. But under their principle, it wouldn't be, because they're just operating from a negative. But when you have a positive set of values of what you are trying to achieve and advance or defend, then I think that gives you a roadmap t- to to respond to a lot of the issues that come up for a free society vis-a-vis its dealings with other nations and foreign affairs, that you libertarians, I find, always just end up driving into a ditch and sounding like cranks and negatives, and and I would say that too, not to continue going in stereotypes, we're probably pushing away all the listening libertarians tonight. But but to your point about the stereotype of sitting around watching Netflix, living in your parents' basement, being slothy, like, I don't. It's probably not a coincidence that many of them often are kind of negative cranks because again, when your whole philosophy or ideology is rooted in a negative, then you're kind of just always on the back foot fighting against things rather than kind of taking the offensive initiative to fight for something.
Well, and to hopefully inspire back in all of our friends who are libertarian leaning, because I think certainly there are so many good people who are associated with the libertarian movement. I think many of the individuals who are libertarians are better than the philosophy itself, which is I think a very
Yes.
important point to mention, and hopefully part of the value that we are adding to this conversation with what it is that we're trying to build. And also, I would say, I think I would agree with many of the libertarians on some of the recent, I would call them shenanigans of some, American foreign policy for the past, well, I don't know even how many decades now of that has been perhaps more empire building than true
Yeah.
self-defense. But you do make a very
Same.
good point that as much as we do not want to be the country that is trying to build empires, that does not mean that we don't want to be a proud country that will fight in our own defense against negative forces that are clearly trying to impede on the real American way of life, are the freedoms that we do still maintain, and that there is a really important distinction there that needs to be made, that we really do need, I think, to articulate a kind of foreign policy that is strong in self-defense without meandering toward improper empire building. But that could be a whole
Yes.
conversation that we will
Correct.
definitely have
Yes. Yeah.
as we get
Well,
more into our political conversation. But let's just
yeah.
even bring it back to virtue, and let's even try to say more about, I really want to try to even flesh out this idea about, oh, why it is that virtue matters so much to have this flourishing free society. Your point that a free society, it presupposes individuals who are capable of self-governing, and that it's
Yeah.
precisely the virtues that allow us to be effectively self-governing, that the virtues in the best sense, this is what they do. And I think this is an important point for us to make too, because while we certainly ascribe to a virtue ethic, and many of the virtues that we put forward are virtues that would be recognized by other philosophers who have spoken about virtue. Um, Certainly, we don't agree with, you might say, the totality of virtues that even the founders might have recognized as virtues from perhaps a very strictly Judeo-Christian background. I find that even now, when you actually hear people in our current cultural discourse who are talking about virtue, virtue is almost synonymous with a religious Judeo-Christian vision of virtue. And that's certainly not what we're talking about. Ours is maybe even closer to a Greco-Roman concept of virtue, a more Aristotelian concept of virtue, which certainly the founders had that as part of their animating philosophy and background as well. But ours is truly distinctive from that as well. I think we really do bring in a kind of modern twist, just our understanding of psychology and flourishing, what we know now in the 21st century, and then just things that are even just unique, I think, to you and I and our process of thought. And that's, I think, a lot of what we'll even get into in our next session when we go into introducing we came up with 11 virtues that we think are core to a flourishing free society. But let's just talk a little bit more then just about why virtue matters so much. And I think you had a question to pose that actually gets us into this conversation. Am I correct?
Yeah. I mean, you kind of stole my thunder. That
I
is
didn't
the
steal your question, though. I was
Yeah,
trying to set
well,
you up.
that is the question is what is it about virtue specifically um, that uh, po- how virtues, I guess, specifically point us in the right direction, and like what about those types of actions makes them conducive to freedom?
Did you want to share your thoughts on this one to get us started, or
Oh no,
do you
I
just
mean,
want to
this,
pose a
if you
question?
recall, this was kind of a question I had posed for us to talk through. So I think, and you kind of have already talked about it. So I think it's just maybe doubling back on and re-emphasizing or highlighting some points you made just about self being a self-disciplined person. You know, that virtues give us the ideal or the standard of action that we benchmark ourselves against, and that they allow us to be effective, to be self-disciplined, which then allows us to be self-governing. So you can almost kind of think of like self to be self-governed means you have control over yourself. You know, you're not just kind of the uh blind rage or emotion or hide of that humans have the potential to be, and especially that freedom kind of totally unbound would allow. Um and and I think to be self-governing kind of presupposes that self-discipline. Well, if we're saying virtues are kind of the roadmap to proper action, that gets you the values that the life-affirming values that we want in that freedom makes possible, like flourishing, greatness, creation, trade, love, etc., then we kind of we need then that to me that's how the virtues do it. So virtues enable you to be self-disciplined, which then to your point earlier, I think, which I think is well said, it's like once you kind of become that type of person, you aren't going to settle for anything less than freedom and self-governance. You kind of already are self-governing within yourself, so it kind of will naturally follow that you expect that vis-a-vis your dealings with other humans, which then ultimately that's all government is just kind of codifying the social arrangement that a community of individuals agree upon. And so I guess that would be, my part answer to it. I know you had some good thoughts when we talked briefly about this offline yesterday as well, which I jotted down. So, but I'll pause there for you to respond first.
So, and I think you explained it really well. This idea that what virtues do is they give you the vision, they give you the aspiration, they give you the standard and the benchmark and the direction and the focus for what to go and do. So even maybe we can just illustrate this with an example. So if you think of a virtue like honesty, right? And it's more even than just like don't tell lies. We could maybe have that whole discussion. But if you were even to think of an honest person and hold that up, some of you might think of a particular individual, maybe you know a family member, a role model, an adult that inspired you as a child that serves as this exemplar of honesty, and it gives you this shining picture of something to aspire to. It gives you a guide to your actions so that, if you're faced with a sort of difficult temptation of perhaps wanting to be less than honest, that honesty gives you that clear direction and guidance of what to do. And then it's what allows you to know, at the end of the day, that if nothing worked out, that that you maintained your honesty, that you maintained your goodness as a person in relationship to others. And so I think that just helps explain to us how it is that virtue helps us to be self-governing. And then, kind of exactly as you said, that once you become an individual who is capable of self-governing, you will never agree to the shackles of any kind of authoritarian government.
Yeah, I think the way, and even to just make your example more explicit or more kind of concrete, but also simplistic. That was the word I was looking for. If you just think about again the honesty virtue, if you just hold that as a standard, I want to be honest, and you're faced with a circumstance where maybe you fuck up at work and you can either your boss asks you, well, what happened? You can either lie about it, blame someone else, or you can be honest, take ownership of it. Like by holding honesty as a virtue, it tells you which path to take in that dilemma. And then the way reality works, that will be the better route for you to take ultimately, because um, one of two things is going to happen if you take the other door of lying about it. Either you're going to get caught and likely lose at least your credibility and trust with your boss, if not your job itself, or you will get it past them for that time, but then you will likely carry the guilt about that, and you'll have to continue lying probably to hide the mistake or hide other people from finding out the truth about the mistake, and then it just creates this vicious spiral, as we see innumerable times in every example of dishonesty and its kind of negative destructive effects that it can have. So, I think that's just again another demonstration of how virtues, again, you have this a list of good actions to take, how just having those as a standard, as a guide, like we're talking about here, can point you in that right direction, which then makes you a self-governing person. I mean, to take the example further, the opposite, the person who lies and isn't honest, in many ways they're not in charge of their own life, because now they're beholden to this false depiction of themselves to other people that they have to maintain through more deception and or just more bad action. So in some ways you could say they're not really in control of themselves and their lives, because it kind of the truth about them is not known, and they have to maintain kind of a fiction with them, just to use the honesty example. And I think that same kind of general operating principle applies in so many other actions and behaviors that we can take in life.
And also, I think what it's demonstrating is how virtue becomes the self-correcting mechanism. So, certainly as humans, none of us are perfect. We all make mistakes at times. You might have even been the person who was tempted at one point to be dishonest and then maybe regretted it. Whereas holding honesty as the virtue then gives you that mechanism to self-correct, to realize, oh, this thing that I did was wrong, and then to seek out forgiveness, to make amends, to try better, to become a better version of yourself. And so, precisely because human beings are not perfect, virtue is that mechanism that allows us, when we do F up. I think you already screwed up our clean ratings for this episode. So that when you are, when it happens that, whatever the circumstances that you do fuck up, that virtue is what allows you to get back on the better path of living into your better and best self.
Right. Yeah. And I think virtues call us, my third of the three kind of phrases for this episode is, because I think this is the right note to kind of close on, which is that virtues, again, focusing on the positive, empowering aspect of them rather than the limiting part, virtues are what call us each to rise up to be and do something better with our life. And that in many ways, that is when we say the self-chosen life and then the self-governing life, it's all about action, and virtues are what help us take the right actions so that we can rise to be our best self.
So I think that gives us a perfect segue then into our call to action for the week and what people can look forward to in our next episode. So from here, we're going to go from this discussion to back to our statement and to introducing we come up with 11, 10 plus a bonus virtues that we identified that Chris and I think are core and crucial to a free society. And we want to make this point right off the bat that these are not the only virtues that we think exist, so that there are many more virtues that are important, especially for a full life, a great life. I think I had suggested that perhaps some of my favorite virtues aren't even on this list. Honesty is not one that I think made our particular list here, although clearly we do obviously think that it is a virtue. But we gave ourselves this assignment to in order to make this concept of virtue helpful and useful, to try to essentialize it down to a number around 10 virtues that we think really matter, that if people were to focus on these 10 plus 1 virtues, that it gives a framework, a kind of living system that can be built off of that would perhaps cover maybe because say the 80/20 do a lot of the leverage of really helping people to be self-governing in the way that is conducive to a flourishing free society. So you could, I guess, go and check our statement if you want to see which are the 11 virtues that we've identified. But before you do that, and especially if you haven't read our statement or read it recently, we'd love for you all to take on that exercise yourself, to ask yourself that if you had to come up with approximately 10 virtues that you think matter most for freedom, what 10 would you pick? And Chris and I are going to be definitely curious to hear what everybody comes up with as we compare it with the list that we came up with ourselves.
I love it, and I will, I'll, I will give people a little bit of break and say, if you can't come up with 10, just give us however many you can come up with. Um,
Well, you might come up with like 50 too, because
Well, right,
there's
yeah,
lots
that
of really
too.
good virtues
And
out
then
there. So,
but I really can't wait to see and hear what others have to say on this front because I'll echo your point about there's hundreds of virtues, literally, you know, of relevance for life in general, but also I think there's many more that matter for free society beyond even the 11 that we picked. So even within the narrower funnel of the virtues that matter for a free society, we're not by any means purporting to suggest these are the be all to end all and exclusive list. So that's why I'm really excited to hear what other people think when putting that filter on of that matter for a free society as well, because we'll get into next week's discussion how and why we came to these 11 specifically. But I can't, we're all about learning and crowdsourcing others' best ideas to help improve our own. So I'd love to hear what the rest of you think. So we'll return to that in a couple weeks, and until then, we'll see you next time.
see you next time.